Husk of corn, perhaps a soybean. If you have, chances are you have inevitably eaten a genetically modified food, more commonly known as GMOs. The fact is that nowadays, it's almost impossible to eat any meal without it having contained any genetically modified products. More and more, our country is becoming extremely dependent on these new scientific experiments. What is genetically modified food? An article, History of Genetically Modified Food by Bradshaw, published in 2016, says that genetically modified food is the splicing of genes to add or subtract a trait from a different species and add it into another species' DNA. Genetically modified food is such a controversial topic because the scientific evidence is supporting both sides of the argument. The use of genetically modified food is a non-zero risk that the foods will cause irreversible and catastrophic harm, and it is appropriate to be precautionary with the foods as stated in the article Mandatory Labeling with GMF by Sunstein, published in 2017. What foods are genetically modified? The most commonly genetically modified foods are corn, soybeans, rice, tomatoes, and potatoes. Over 80% of all U.S. corn is genetically modified. High fructose corn syrup and citric acid are one of the ways that they hide the genetically modified products in our everyday food. According to Examining the Gap Between Science and Public Opinion by McFadden, 60 to 70% of all processed foods on American shelves include at least a fragment of genetically modified crop. It's extremely hard not to eat GMOs in your diet. Ever since the first genetically engineered product, a tomato, went on the market in 1994, by 1998, transgenic crops covered 27.8 million hectares worldwide, stated in the article Genetically Modified Food by Marushka, published by Tarufa State Agro-Technological University. And the market for these keeps growing. As seen in 2014, the GMFs were highest in 2014 with 100 million hectares. The U.S. is by far the largest producer of GMOs. With 70 million hectares, Brazil is following us cautiously behind with only 35 million hectares. In the article Genetically Modified Organisms, Disclosure and Labeling by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, states that in July 2017, President Obama passed a bill making it mandatory to label all genetically modified foods. But the Department of Agriculture has 2 years to come up with a plan on how to label the foods. So the majority of the foods on the shelf that still have genetically modified foods in them aren't labeled still. Other countries such as France are very cautious of these. Nucera, Robin, and Rufio find in their survey, do customers really refuse genetically modified food, that 35% of French participants are unwilling to purchase products made with genetically modified organisms. And it's not just France. 60 other countries, including Japan and all the other EU countries, either don't allow any GMOs or are extremely strict with them. There are some positives to genetically modified organisms, though. A product called golden rice is popular in developing countries because of the extreme nutritional value that it holds. Golden rice is modified with the vitamin A that is most commonly found in carrots. It is more nutritious for people eating it. Vitamin A and the presence of vitamin A and iron helps with the possibility of blindness and iron deficiencies. The article Forum on the Role of Genetically Modified Organisms in the Future of Agriculture by Kaplan, Winkler Prinz, published in 2017, talks about how genetically modified organisms could ease food availability and the access of food in struggling third world countries. The fruits and vegetables become more resistant to harsh weather, making it easier for the countries to manage them. Some scientists believe that it could even end the world food crisis. Less maintenance means less cost for the farmers. And it will become cheaper for the customer as well if the farmers don't have to pay as much. There are many negative aspects to these, though. The new food can cause herbicide-resistant weeds, or superweeds, and can cause even larger problems for the farmer, with having to pay to get rid of the weeds that are killing their crops. Genetically modified foods and normal plants can't coexist together. The genetically modified plant will overpower the other plant because it is more resistant, and then the entire crop will be covered in genetically modified foods. The presence of these in the ecosystem can ruin years of evolution. Genetically modified organisms, once they are placed in the ecosystem, are very hard to remove because they are so resistant to everything. The main reason why people are against genetically modified organisms is the claim that they cause food allergies. The article Genetically Modified Food by Snyder and Schneider, published in 2006, explains that the protein from one of these foods were to be incorporated into food that normally wouldn't have this protein. People who are allergic to these proteins could unknowingly consume such a food and have an allergic reaction. Essentially, the scientists will create an allergic reaction in someone who didn't know that they had one. In the article, Consumer Acceptance of GMOs, by Curtis, McCluskey, and Wall, warns that international biosafety protocols are necessary to ensure that developing countries prevent the risk of genetically engineered crops, endangering domestic crop diversity in their crops. Even though people say that genetically modified organisms need less herbicides on them, herbicides like Roundup has grown, the sale for herbicides like Roundup has grown 15 times since the first use of GMOs in our environment. GMOs have also caused a decline in natural pollinators like bees and butterflies, which causes a larger problem for our ecosystem altogether. In an article by Livestrong.com, written by Caroline Thompson, published in 2017, discusses the concerns of eating genetically modified organisms and the best ways to avoid genetically modified foods by cooking at home with organic food products. All you have to do is look for the USDA Organic Seal of Approval. Most organic products that contain over 70% of organic products in them are not allowed to have any genetically modified organisms in them. And most packaged food at grocery stores is where the genetically modified organisms come from. So shopping locally can help you and can help your local farmer as well. It's also important to avoid certain products, like soy and corn. How I said earlier that over 80% of them are genetically modified. They're hidden in common foods as amino acids, vitamin C, high fructose corn syrup, and yeast products, and can be found in breads, granola bars, and some meat products. In conclusion, there hasn't been enough time to see how genetically modified foods will interact with our environment in the future. While there is some positive effects of genetically modified food, like stronger, more resistant plants, and can even help with more nutrition for developing countries, long-term effects of genetically modified food are unknown, and it is hard to predict how these rogue plants that are now such a huge part of our everyday ecosystem will affect the world's environment and humanity.